Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. In December 2021, the exhibition June Paik, The Future Is Now, opens at the National Gallery, Singapore. This is an exhibition co-curated by Sook-Kyung Lee, Senior Research Curator from Tate, and Rudolf Frieling, Curator of Media Arts from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and presented in collaboration with curators from two partner institutions as the exhibition toured to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and then finally to us in Singapore. We are delighted to have with us today Sook-Kyung and Rudolf for a joint lecture that draws upon their extensive research and long contemplation of the practice and life of Paik. They will be elaborating upon key concepts manifested in the exhibition and reflecting upon the legacy of this deeply influential artist. Speaking from a perspective that is simultaneously retrospective and contemporary, they will also be highlighting significant artworks shown within this comprehensive exhibition tour. So without further ado, I will hand the time over to Rudolf. Rudolf, please.
Thank you. Thanks to the whole team at the National Gallery in Singapore. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will kick off our lecture by just saying it's been a pleasure to work with Sook-Kyung Lee on this for many, many years now. And we've had a sort of curatorial impulse, I would say, a professional urgency and curiosity to review and maybe reposition June Paik as an artist who we think is relevant to our contemporary world, but we still need to understand and find out why that is the case today, and if that is in fact the case. So we wanted to include, but also go beyond the well-known path of June Paik as a video pioneer and focus our attention at his identity, on his identity as a collaborator and performer in a global perspective. Sue will address the theme of transnationalism, which also means being aware of a very specific local context and the way that these contexts supported Paik, but also provoked him, made him stand out. And I'm going to start by talking about a moment about post-war Germany in the late 50s and 1960s. It was a place where he did not fit in easily. It was a very fraught place, full of trauma and tensions, but also full of energy to play catch up with modernity. This was before the wall was built in 1963, when the Allied forces had divided up Germany and began to modernize the country based on their ideologies. These two images were important for me to get an intro into Paik. Paik, who was extremely well-read, very conscious of the various Western and Eastern histories of philosophy and music. But he began to perform Paik in Germany as a poor Korean, as a Korean who had emigrated to Japan because of the Korean War, had studied in Japan, but then moved to Germany in 1956 to study classical Western music, but where he, after a few years, had changed course and began to perform the role of a charismatic Asian disruptor of classical music traditions. So this one image on the left illustrates the beginning of his career. It's a letter from a letter in the early 60s. And it shows him as a sort of self-conscious but slightly mocking agent provocateur, closely associated with the Fluxus movement. But then he revolutionized the notion of performing music. Here, a dramatic photo on the right from his performance in Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Originale in 1961 in Cologne, Germany, in which he used actions with water, shampoo, beans thrown into the audience, very much to the protest of the public. But also he used very simple and silent gestures. He never played a single musical note, and yet it was his way of performing within a musical performance of Stockhausen's electronic new music titled Kontakte, or Contacts. And the next picture is kind of like a blueprint for a lot of his steps or adventures in his career, throughout his career, I would almost say. It's an unrealized score from 61, 62, and it's called Symphony for 20 Rooms. It's a key work, which immediately makes you wonder, why is it called 20 rooms when there are only 16 squares? A riddle that we could not solve. But what you do realize immediately is just the sheer density of his thinking, his proposal. You read rooms that incorporate live music, an orchestra of bad musicians, live animals like a hen, pre-recorded music and speeches on tape, live radio, record players, and a mix of everything, including a vast range of musical traditions that are typically never in the same room together or in the same performance. And most importantly, he early on emphasized the notion of audience participation. In fact, he declared as the next step towards indeterminacy, a term he loaned from Cage, I wanted the audience to act and play by itself. So I have resigned the performance of music, I expose the music. And here you see a detail from the score and a picture of a sculpture he did 2 years later. So is there a time and space where we could value bad music or a bad orchestra? Maybe if we walked through the orchestra and could hear differences of each individual player, each individual instrument. Something, by the way, that Janet Cardiff picked up 40 years later. Actively participating in his works required an open-minded audience that would also engage by listening intently to silences, sound bites, and the sound of beans thrown into the audience as if it were Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. Paik's approach to space was not to construct his own ideal room as an empty space, but rather to infiltrate, if not outright invade, whatever room was available, but to do it in a way that nobody had done before. So he didn't need the concert hall, he didn't need the white cube, but he also completely rethought the tools for making music and what constitutes an instrument and what can be considered a musical performance. In his manifesto from 1963 called Post Music, he asked, why is it music? And his answer is, because it is not music. So why only play one record at a time when you can mix them constantly with this brand new tool called record shish kebab, which you see on the right here. In some ways, the next show that he did, or actually the first show that he did in 1963, addressed some of these key concepts early on, and this is one example of many. I'm focusing on this one as this is also one of the key works in the retrospective. So he used prepared pianos like John Cage, but he let the audience play. He used pre-recorded audio tape, but he let the human hand replace the motor of the machine moving along the audio head of the tape player, as you can see here in random access. On the left, the historical photograph from 1963, and on the right, a more recent picture from an exhibition copy of the Guggenheim Museum. This was first installed in the basement of a villa, which accommodated his very first exposition of music and electronic television in 1963 in Wuppertal, Germany. But what is shown in the retrospective is what I just called an exhibition copy, which also illustrates a central strategy in Paik's work. And that is concepts realized in the same spirit with the same ideas, but not repeating the exact same configuration ever. The source material can be the same. In this case, it's audio tape with the sounds of sinus waves, drums and cymbals, noise, and silences, but always reproduced in a form of a maze or an urban chaotic grid within reach of the visitor who decides to play this instrument. Again, is it music? It is not music. The work signals the important shift from a classical music instrument such as violin or piano to the playback system becoming an instrument. And Paik, as a predecessor of DJs or artists like Christian Markley and the whole contemporary history of sampling in music. The invite to this exhibition, called Exposition of Music Electronic Television, is also a mixing of languages, very much mirroring the mixing of music that led Paik to use German, English, French, printed on a Korean daily paper as a background, on various changing parts of that Korean daily paper. An entire room in the retrospective is also dedicated to his most important collaborators, Charlotte Moorman, with whom he invented a whole series of hybrid performances with monitors, cameras, and cello. And that notion of taking music out of the concert hall, retooling its components, inviting the audience to participate, that led him to a series of other proposals outside of music, but always in memory of, or in homage of, or even in the spirit of music. So let me change gear now and offer a second beginning to the retrospective by talking about the emergence of video as a medium, as opposed to the interventions into his amazing TV sculptures and hardware manipulations. What we're looking at is a work called Hand and Face from 1961, a black and white film transferred to digital video, a silent film, and it was part of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Originale. It was performed for a film camera, obviously before video cameras were available to artists or consumers. The film is as simple as possible, extremely short with an almost banal action. The covering of his face with his hand and the slow reveal of his face. It was shot in 1961 as a material for a possible inclusion of a projected image in the theatrical performance in Cologne. And it's the first document of Paik showing an interest in the moving image. Opposite of simple, one of his most dramatic actions with a violin slowly raised above his head and then with a sudden and shocking release of destruction. The next time we see him producing something that we could call a moving image, a film, or in this case now, a video image, is in 1965. It is called Button Happening, and once again, it's a very, very simple action. It's the first preserved videotape that exists of Paik, and it looks like an archaeology of video, badly preserved even, but all components are artistically composed. The beginning of video was analog. It was an open reel, but it was also the aesthetic of a poor image. Nothing compared to film. The electronic nature of turning on a television set, seeking a channel, was bracketed by moments of instability and interference, a weak signal, not unlike, by the way, today's changing condition of Wi-Fi reception. But we should note here that it's an image recorded that is not only compromised if we were to compare it to film, but that is deliberately and immediately distorted. Here you see a second set of stills from that video. In other words, Paik was not interested in representation of reality, but in the energy and dynamic of electrons constituting an image, its process, its glitches, the slow, unstable constitution of an electronic signal. He seems to ask, why would you want me to watch me button up my jacket? In other words, that is not interesting. The action is not interesting. The gesture of buttoning and unbuttoning is in itself a relation to the unstable condition of an electronic image between a rendering of a reality in front of a camera and the absence of an indexical relationship as expressed in the absence of a camera input and the expressivity of pure white noise. In Paik's world, these two sides of the spectrum cannot be separated neatly. He is never in search of the perfect image quality. In fact, almost the opposite. And here's another great Paik quote on that note. When too perfect, lieber Gott böse, dear God is angry. The energy of an electronic image lies in its performativity, including its imperfection. Is it beautiful? Well, it is not beautiful. In other contexts today, artists speak of the troubling the image, of questioning its very foundation and status. We could also call it a medium-specific aesthetic and the beginning of video art. From this point on, Paik produced dozens of ever more complex videotapes, initially recorded still by 16 millimeter film cameras off the television monitor, mostly operated by his collaborator Jad Jalkut. But as soon as he had some cash, he would then invest it into recording and editing equipment, building his own electronic studio. But parallel to that, he grabbed every opportunity to exploit the technologically advanced infrastructure of proper television studios whenever invited, and to address the broadcasting system. Video and participation is a third topic in my mind. Participation of the public, that is. With equipment for the recording and broadcasting images eventually becoming widely available, Paik recognized that every consumer could be a potential producer and go live, helping television and video technologies to become more democratic tools for cultural output. He was promoting a more human-centered use of technology in the networks, but also outside of them. One key question he had was, how could the public take ownership of television? What forms of participation might be possible, and how could that relate in new ways to his vision of a musical total work of art, or in his words, a total electronic opera? Electronic Opera No. 1 from 1969 was in fact Paik's contribution to one of the first television programs on video art called The Medium is the Medium. It was broadcast by WGBH in Boston, who had commissioned 6 artists, including Paik, to create original works for a special artist transmission. And in an ironic twist on the idea of interactive television, Paik presented a form of what he called participation TV, where he instructs viewers to open or close their eyes while displaying his creative use of the video synthesizer developed with the Japanese engineer Shuya Abe. This was but a first attempt to break open the one-way communication system, a minimal one for sure, more symbolic than anything else. But then we look now at Video Commune pictured here, Beatles from beginning to end a year later. Again, with WGBH, and he used the funds he received from the television broadcasting company to build an analog video synthesizer with Shuya Abe. And Video Commune re-edited in 1992 to an 8.5 minute record of an originally 4-hour live program. It was an improvised montage of distorted television imagery accompanied by songs from the Beatles' back catalog. Theoretically, if you were following his instructions at home in your living room, on your couch, to then play any record you felt would match the pictures that you were receiving. So he also invited also random passersby into the studio and let them remix the videos. You see a few of those blurry images, layered images, very fluid, if you will. And the work's current form today in the exhibition is something where you can either listen to a random playset, or in the case of SFMOMA, we decided to offer an online version of Video Commune, so you could play your own video with a Beatles soundtrack of your own choosing back at home or on the go, so to speak. From that moment onward, Paik used ever more complex tool set of video manipulation. Here you see another example from a few years later, Mers by Paik, almost a decade later, and we see a much more sophisticated electronic editing program and aesthetic and approach, collaging, layering, distorting, remixing images on and on. Rarely does he leave an image alone, sitting there to be studied or interpreted. Nothing is fixed or stable in his world. Here we see two stills from a studio production mixed with some bit of cinema verite documentation. And it's an homage to dancer and choreographer Maurice Cunningham, but also to avant-garde artist Marcel Duchamp. Part one realized in collaboration with Charles Atlas, part two in collaboration with his partner and wife, Shigeko Kubota. Around the same time that Paik revolutionized the production of video art tapes, he also revolutionized the use of space and video. So TV Garden is possibly one of the most intriguing, seductive notions of Paik using space to display video. You see about 40 monitors displayed in a lush tropical garden of live plants. You watch John Cage, as pictured here, or Charlotte Mormon, or Allen Ginsberg, or many other collaborators and snippets from performances all over the world. He exposed television in space, so to speak, and he did that radically. It's a total environment of one single tape displayed 40 or more than 40 times, depending on the available space. So in his video, this is possibly what one could call the first music tape, video clip, kind of spearheading what later became known as MTV style aesthetics. But it is also the idea that more is more. He expands in space one single image and lets it manipulate you, massage you with its atmosphere and its ubiquitousness. It helps the public to embrace the idea of electronic imagery that becomes part of our world, part of the furniture, part of our bodies, part of the spaces we walk through. He let, in Marshall McLuhan's terms, he let the media massage us. And this brings me to arguably his most impressive and certainly the largest part of the retrospective, the finale, if you will. It's called Sistine Chapel from 1993. And when Sue and I discussed the checklist and what might be a contribution of this retrospective to the scholarship around Paik and through to the many catalogs that had been produced in the past, we thought we should produce something that nobody or almost nobody had seen before outside of Venice. And that was this one work to reconstruct the Sistine Chapel, which at the time seemed site-specific to Venice. It was commissioned for the German pavilion in which June Paik was invited alongside the German artist Hans Haacke to represent Germany in 1993. A bold move, but also a bold move on behalf of Paik to use that scale and that quantity and number of video projectors to inhabit an entire space that he called Sistine Chapel. Obviously, the reconstruction was done in close collaboration with John Hoffman, Paik's assistant at the time and now curator of the estate, looking at every side of the original location, looking at the ceiling, looking at the 4 different video sources, and reconstituting the same effect to occupy space, to throw literally video all over the place, not as a realistic simulation in an architectural mapping, but rather as an excess of blurry and distorted imagery interfering with each other. A visual language that refuses to be locked in to any notion of true representation. Another quote by Paik: "The freedom must have more than two ways, directions, vectors, and possibilities of time." So the Paik effect has often been described as electronic wallpaper. I would rather call it, with Paik himself, an electronic gestalt, where not the reading of details and the consumption of realistic representation is the viewer's challenge, but rather a call for an openness to let a holistic audiovisual experience happen. Again, in McLuhan's terms, a massaging of relationships and impressions, where John Cage and Joseph Beuys are mass media stars next to Laurie Anderson, David Bowie, Janis Joplin, or Lou Reed. Here is the same work in a picture by the Tate in 2019. To me, this is a lasting legacy of Paik, his way of embracing complexities, ambiguities of an unhinged world, of distributing images digitally and live, a live remix that he easily and constantly juxtaposed with his return to the simplicity of a hand-drawn gesture or a flickering candle. And the way that this becomes more obvious is this one image from SFMOMA's installation period, where you see the way that images are overlapping each other and also inhabiting whatever space they are given. The bigger, the better, almost. The ceiling is very marked through skylights here, but also very much embraced by this way of projecting images, not to realistically simulate and map a 360-degree environment, but to distort and inhabit and embody a different attitude towards space. And finally, here is the finished installation, or one installation image from SFMOMA. To conclude, I would say, Paik's criticality was grounded in his insistence on participation, collaboration, and two-way communication. But he certainly didn't reject the very medium, the technology per se. He simply wanted more, 1,000 platforms. You could say he would have been extremely happy about his own YouTube channel, but sadly died in 2006, shortly after the social media revolution started. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudolf. May I next ask Sook-Kyung to continue with her presentation. Sook-Kyung, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. And it is a really great opportunity to talk about this exhibition that started quite a while ago in London, Tate Modern, but then which traveled to the US and then now in Asia. I think it's important to note that the curatorial collaboration with Rudolf has always hoped that exhibition might be represented in different continents Paik lived and worked. So I'm very pleased that Asia has been included in this world tour. And what I can really start with is this iconic work by June Paik, TV Buddha. TV Buddha was really what made me realize how important this combination of transnational, philosophical, and lived experience has been to Paik's work. He was the artist who was born in Korea and then lived in Japan, Germany, and the US, working across all these different continents with the different collaborators, but never really lost his cultural heritage or his understanding of the world through different perspectives. And I think TV Buddha really manifests that combination of ideas, but also accumulation of different lived experiences, but also as a kind of a reminder to always revisit where the artist might have come from. So Namjoon was born in now South Korea, in Seoul. His family was quite an affluent business family who were able to move out of Korea during the Korean War in 1950. And since then, he was sort of living this life as a refugee, but also immigrant. And his upbringing in Seoul in that time of Japanese colonial ruling is really something that shaped his artistic thinking as well as his existence as a person. And what we can really sort of see in his continuing note-making was about his interest in Chinese historical anecdotes, but also Buddhist monks' tales, and also some Taoist anecdotes, which you hear as a person growing up in East Asia. That experience is still continuing in some ways, because as a person grown up in Seoul in the 90s, I also share that sort of very basic education I got, and didn't even realize how important these things might have been. And it seems that Namjoon Paik was also very much interested in this sort of embedded kind of learning and knowledge he acquired as a person grown up in East Asia. And when he actually first met the American composer, the experimental composer John Cage in 1958, he was quite surprised to find out that this American composer who was experimenting with different ideas from what might have been very conventional classical music, like the idea of indeterminacy and also chance, was actually a big sort of a investigator of this idea of Zen. So Zen was the kind of Buddhist idea, a part of the Buddhism that was sort of beginning to get some kind of attention in the US by these sort of cultural innovators and also these different thinkers such as John Cage. And when Namjoon Paik was sort of trying to fit in to this experimental music world in West Germany by the time, he wasn't really considering his cultural heritage as something that would be worth considering or rethinking. But by meeting John Cage in the late 50s, he realized that actually he did have something that might be really quite an alternative way of understanding the world, but also the sort of artistic medium, but the ways that the artist could experiment with. So this performance of Zen for Head is one of those things he performed in West Germany and also in other parts of Germany, and Europe, and later in the US. But the idea of Zen in this particular work can be understood in many different ways, but also sort of in relation to the artistic medium of calligraphy and the horizontality of the paper, but also this one stroke making the whole work really relate to what the East Asian calligraphic practice might be, but he's combining it with very avant-garde and experimental way of performing these things as one of the sort of Fluxus-related artists at the time. And in his first solo exhibition in '63, the Exposition of Music and Experimental Television, he also used this idea of Zen in many different works, but also with his sort of exploration of experimental music and also early sort of performance practices, which were understood under the term of happening or action music. So like you see here at Tate Modern, this sort of collection of different works that were shown or included in that exhibition in '63 really looked at a lot of different sides of this idea of Zen. As you can see from left is Zen for TV, and in the sort of enlarged photograph you can see Zen for walk, which actually has a violin at the end of this string. And in electronic sort of medium like TV, but also in the sort of practice of performance, and on the right in sort of ready-made installation of objects, he uses this idea of Zen to inquire very different aspects of this relationship between being and non-being, but also how ideas like chance and different ways of determining reality and different sides of existence could coexist. And going back to TV Buddha, this is quite a simple work in terms of the medium and the way it is installed. There is a ready-made Buddha statue from a sort of antique shop, and there is a camera, CCTV camera, that feeds that image of the Buddha into the monitor, TV monitor in front of it. So this cyclical nature of CCTV camera system is used to represent or sort of relate to the idea of cyclical time in Buddhist sort of thinking, but also looking back, the sort of the sense of self-reflection in this Zen Buddhist type of meditation practice, and looking at sort of a humorous side about such a profound idea being linked to that type of sort of vanity of self-representation as well. So I think this work has many different aspects you could read into, and also have different ways of interpreting according to your own interest and your own context. Nixon is a very interesting work in its political content. It shows the images of former US President Richard Nixon, who was in this scandal called Watergate, and famously being expelled from his position as the US president by lying and sort of manipulating the facts. And this work has, again, quite simple ways of representing this idea of distorting truth, or questioning the authenticity of what's being shown on TVs, and using magnetic coils as the very physical interfering apparatus to distort the images on these CRT TVs. Paik is showing sometimes distorted, sometimes straight images of Nixon's public speeches. So what we now call as fake news and these sort of different versions of truth is quite an interesting and satirical take on these images of TV, images of broadcasting, and how we may, as a public, to understand what's been represented to us as truth and authentic stories, and how we might actually have to question these things as simply as like distorted images by a magnetic field. And magnet was really something he used as a physical interfering object as early as in 1965. And in this very famous work using magnet TV, the physical nature of magnets actually distorting the images through CRT tube was almost like sculptural experimentation. But what he has done since then was really to look at the manipulation of these images as a way of representing some ideas. And as seen in Nixon, this sort of physical sculptural experimentation could also be linked to something that is more inherently doubtful about broadcasters' messages. And another work that has kind of political undertone is Guadalcanal Requiem. So I'm just singling out these two works as something quite explicitly political and which have some messages behind these video experimentations that are actually looking at what was happening at the time in the political dimension of Paik's life. The next suite of works I would like to talk about are Paik's satellite projects from the 80s. So in 1984, on the first day of January, he broadcasted on the satellite in different places on the globe, namely New York, Paris, and Seoul, to show this work titled Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. So the title of the work reflects very well-known novel by George Orwell, 1984, that is a tale of dystopian future, which has a quite dark sort of expectation of the technologies of surveillance and mass communication. But on that day of 84, the first day of 1984, Nam June Paik was kind of saying, hey, this isn't too bad. This hasn't turned out that bad. But that optimistic view of that year perhaps was the way how Nam June Paik was trying to understand the world, but also trying to influence the world he was living in through his work. Because this very interesting and also very revolutionary take on satellite broadcasting was really about transnational and also transcultural combination of different aspects of traditional, but also contemporary, and very high art and avant-garde, and mass entertainment like pop culture, and very much about West, but also East, and different kind of take on the culture on a more planetary level. So he was seeing the world certainly as one planet, one world, and one global village. And as mentioned earlier, this video commune was the first broadcasting work he made using fully of Paik Abe video synthesizer he made the year before. And this kind of really long take on video editing and also playback of what's been available as mass entertainment, but also mixing them with highly experimental artistic practice of his friends and collaborators. That was really a unique take and unique visual language Nam June Paik established through this video, especially these broadcasting projects. And in 1977, he also experimented with satellite as a way of communicating with different places at the same time in Documenta 6 satellite telecast, which was a collaboration with Charlotte Moorman and Joseph Beuys and Douglas Davis. So in 1986, he made the second satellite project called Bye Bye Kipling. This was more about direct response to these questions or questioning of the binary between the West and East. And he was obviously referring to Rudyard Kipling's remark on this impossibility of meeting of the two different worlds that are East and West, and saying actually that that can be done in this sort of more culturally focused way of communication. And this was on the occasion of Korea's sort of Asian Game, which is a sports sort of festival, obviously. And he was also trying to make this very widely loved sort of sports festival as a way of injecting more perceived sort of difficult or hard to understand type of experimental art. And in 1988, his last and third satellite project titled Wrap Around the World was presented. And this was again a very much conscious mixture of different types of creativity. And it does actually have aliens and all this sort of mock interviews between the Earth presenter, TV anchor, and the alien coming down to this world and looking at the creativity on the planetary level and how that may be perceived as one type of creative product by human beings rather than culturally divided or very much differentiated. So this really culminated that era of 1988 and also that decade of 1980s for him. And as you may remember, that was also the beginning of the end of Cold War era, and that was particularly pertinent for June Paik, who obviously suffered these legacies of Cold War and military tensions around that time. And he was very hopeful that perhaps the world will actually see the sort of more harmonious and more peaceful era that may be coming after this decade. The last work I would like to talk about is One Candle, also known as Candle TV. It's actually quite simple work in the old emptied out TV casing. There is a candle which is lit. So it flickers as someone passes by or just coming in to look at, but also it shows this very interesting process of looking at technology as already a ruin in the making. And as a sort of a person who has been looking at technology as a really interesting artistic medium, it's interesting to see he has also looked at the technology as a very much an empty shell or almost like a non-existent thing, but still referring to TV as a way of understanding that type of technological advancement within human civilization. What I like about this work is about this precarious nature of all beings and existence. And just by simply putting these two things together, he's able to really start quite a profound questioning about what might be the being, what might be the nothingness, what could be the sort of creative energy, but also kind of the demise of human civilization based on technology. So maybe it's just too much to read into it, but I think that that ability for this work to open up these questions to us and also in this very fast sort of an environment of different technological advancements. I think it is interesting to sort of say he was already thinking about these sort of questions which may come after a certain time. And when you sort of see them together with other sort of drawings of TV Buddha, for instance, and more reflective and meditative works in his drawings, I think that also shows very clear meditative qualities of this practice, which aren't really that much known, but I think also very much present in this exhibition. I would also like to say this juxtaposition was really the way he presented certain ideas as contrast, but also as a way of understanding them as a whole thing. The whole entity becoming sort of that conflict within the presence of these things were very important. And again, I'm looking at this TV garden as one way of looking this sort of conflict within the nature and technology, but becoming one environment, we as human race are all in together. And obviously this candle idea was later manifested in a larger installation form as well, in this candle projection. And again, the live candle has that sort of a very precarious flickering in this work. And just by looking at that tiny little thing, we just kind of bring these questions up to the sort of surface, just thinking about what is the one I'm seeing, but also what was it that the artist wanted to talk about through these very simple installations and positioning of everyday object. So yeah, I think in this exhibition, you will also see many different things, and you will be able to perhaps make up your own interpretation of these different things.
Thank you, Sook-Kyung. And thanks again also to Rudolf for your illuminating presentations. We are really appreciative of your having brought us through highlights of the exhibition and for speaking so persuasively on critical aspects of Paik's practice and his oeuvre. It is indeed uncanny to see when we look around us today how far-sighted Paik was. I think it is fantastic also how you both have distilled as well as brought us deep into Paik's legacy in a way that brings Paik to life. In putting together the exhibition in Singapore, our curatorial team has been fascinated by Paik, researching into Paik's history and thoughts about Asia. So Rudolf's description of Paik's reflexive and tongue-in-cheek representation of himself articulated in the phrase, "the yellow peril, c'est moi," did strike us too as encapsulating Paik's wit and playfulness. At the same time, Sook-Kyung's mention of how Paik tapped into Asian practices such as Zen, with arguably Zen-like precision and a knack for the unexpected, is evidence of how expertly Paik navigated cultural histories and representation. But to also quote Charlotte Mormon, working with Paik was play, though serious play, with this revealing Paik and Mormon's commitment to the creative process. Paik draws us in, not just into the medium itself, but into his curiosity-filled creative world. So we are very pleased to be able to share this exhibition further with our audiences here, with historic works from multiple collections, including local ones. For an exhibition of an artist who, if I may quote our speakers, is both an Asian disruptor and an transnational avant-garde, who nevertheless embodied his cultural heritage. This is an artist who, with great energy, overturned assumptions, with astute skill, investigated the medium of television as it emerged, deconstructing and creatively recomposing its form and possibilities, and with much enthusiasm, connected ideas, philosophies, and people. So we are grateful to both of you for sharing so generously your knowledge and curation of the exhibition. We are also really appreciative of the June Paik estate, to Ken Hakuta and John Huffman for our realization of the exhibition here, as we experience and read Paik from within Asia. And to our audiences and viewers who are in Singapore, we hope this will contribute to your enjoyment and appreciation of the exhibition. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.